We are at a total global crisis point. And there's only, to my mind, two options. One is a fairly rapid descent into complete chaos, or joining the procession and following the jazz band down the road.
I think that at some point there'll be big shifts. Maybe continents will disappear, or parts of countries will disappear.
You know, what's the point in worrying? There could be a comet heading for this Earth at the moment, going to blow us all. There's nothing we can do about it except enjoy the interim.
If a tsunami comes, there would be probably 70 meters or so, and you only can kiss your kids goodbye. You can't do anything, you can only enjoy the ride, if it washes you away.
The way we've exploited all our resources, how we're now increasingly fobbing it off to our younger generation to try and fix up.
Because we've destroyed so much that we are now facing the task of surviving with very little, because we'll have very little left.
Radiation, nuclear fallouts, environmental things.
And I'm particularly concerned about our oceans. I'm concerned about what we put in our oceans, and I'm concerned about the acidity of the oceans. And that would be an area that I want to understand a lot more.
Every time a particular species of fish gets fished out, they say, oh, well, let's go and fish another species which isn't fished out yet.
Foremost in my mind is war and other countries wanting to dominate another country. And when it's done for the so-called religious reasons, it's very disheartening. For me, war is still the biggest fear.
I would really like to see a world in which my grandchildren and great-grandchildren can feel a part of things, that they can be a comfortable citizen in this country and of the world, that in which there's peace, there's no war, and in which the climate hasn't changed to the extent that it's impossible to live in.
My fear is that my grandchildren won't have the kind of skills to actually live the life they're going to need to live, and the adaptability to learn to do it, because they've become so dependent on having stuff done for them and having so much material wealth and so much technology.
See, I'm slowly pulling myself out of the world of technology now, because I'm going, oh, I can live without this. We can live without this. I've never been on Facebook, and I'm sure there's good reasons to be on Facebook, but I will not be now because it's taking up my world.
But that's one of the problems with this, the cancer of the capitalist system, is it keeps on going on growth, and it is just going to be physically impossible for it to keep on, so it will collapse.
The kind of lifestyle that we in the Western world live at the moment, if we spread that around all of the people on the planet, you need 5 planets. That's not sustainable.
I don't have any doubt that the human race is going to survive. The issue is the quality of the survival.
I try not to worry about the world because it's a bit futile, but I feel more and more that Hokianga is one of the places that will consolidate and survive no matter what happens.
If you look at the scientific statistics at the moment, you'd probably say we'll be lucky to have another 10 years. As soon as you say that, you flip that over the other way and you say, if we can destroy the world in 10 years, we can save it in 10 years.
Where the birds fly high and the trees reach to touch the sky. Homeland, where the roots go deep, but richness for all to read. Homeland, where there's warm and understand.
Okay, babies. Hello, babies. Good baby. I was born in the Bronx, and I grew up in Westchester County and in northern New Hampshire,
where my parents ran a derelict farm and a poor-ass summer resort. My father was one of the most lovable people alive. Everybody loved my father. He just had something that everyone just immediately looks at them and they love him. That was a little hard for my mother to take. Everybody always loved my father and she felt that they never loved her. Which wasn't true, but that's how she felt inside. So I have both of that. I have the bitterness of my mother inside me, and I have the lovableness of my father inside me, and they're both there. During a lot of that period, I was a boy, because I had discovered that among children's toys, boys' toys were a lot better than the girls' toys. So I decided to be a boy, and I named myself Peter Michael. I played with the boys. Everyone thought I was a boy, and I just never went to the toilet. And it was only after I sort of began to reach adulthood that I realized that people kicking me in the shins and calling me a dirty kike, well, there was some cognitive dissonance in there. There they were all united fighting Hitler and then sort of picking on the Jews in the neighborhood. I mean, MERIANA had very few Jews in it. We might have been one of 2 or 3 Jewish families in the whole suburb. But I was a bright kid, and I ended up getting degrees in mathematics and theology. And then I went off to the University of Chicago, where I met Donald.
My story is, my landlord once said, there's this strange woman at the divinity school, you'd like to meet her. She came to the Computer Institute to buy a copy of The Hobbit. I sold it to her, and there was this fine, upstanding young woman, beautifully dressed in what I believe we later called the Frau General Director suit, saying most wonderful things about Christianity.
Some people have conversion experiences, 1 minute they don't believe and the next minute they believe, but I was not that kind of person. It sort of, little by little things got into my consciousness. And we're all going to have a good time. We're promised that there will be the greatest of feasts and it will be everlasting. All the best food that anyone has ever eaten. And we will all experience that bliss of sexual union. And better than ever, and always, super fucks. There will be... What's the matter? After 30 years here, one weekend I invited a whole slew of people and animals to my local marae. That Sabbath day, we celebrated the various roads that brought us to Hokianga.
Thank you. The person who can tell me what I've come for.
No. Tony Watkins and I agree about Hokianga's unique character. And of course, on a mutual love of pigs.
They did this amazing film of Piglet, which got onto the BBC News, and it was so successful that they put it on every hour.
Hello, Piglet.
Pigs, they say, are as intelligent as dogs. But if you're fond of a bacon sandwich, there's discomforting news. Some scientists now say pigs share our ability to enjoy the finer things in life.
Piglet, how's that for paradise?
Piglet was raised like a family pet, part of an Auckland community.
They were raffling off a pig and he bought raffle tickets. And he won. So there he was with this pig and he took it back to Auckland. City bylaws say you can't have a pig in the city. He said, yes, I can. This pig lives here. And it was for 4 months, it was on the front page of the Herald.
And then it was voted the best program of the week.
The reason most of us don't easily perceive their personalities or have a sense of what or how they feel is because we don't spend enough time with them.
The new research is likely to increase calls for improvements in animal welfare. Anita McNaught, BBC News, New Zealand.
Tomorrow, I'm assuming the meaning of life will become clear. They say the answer actually is Piglet. Is this true?
I say it's Piglet.
Oh, yeah, I say it's Piglet too, then, so that's all right. Congratulations on Piglet!
Judy Mori mai toiwi. Haere mai toiwi kia ho mai rātou I roto tō tātou whare mā whakamāharatanga tō tātou marae. Haere mai, haere mai, haere mai.
Ka tiritiri a, ka paupau a, kia papatu anku, ka puta te ira tangata ki te whai a, ki te aumaro. Ui e, tae ki e.
There is almost nothing that worries me that I can't do something about. And this gives me huge hope. We think of Waitangi, but Waitangi was the meeting at a political level under a veranda. Here, it's about two cultures with respect. Meeting as equals and becoming a people. And so this, when I stand here, I feel I'm a New Zealander. When I stand over at Waitangi, I feel that I'm part of a political game. Many early New Zealanders came here and disappeared into the mangroves, if you understand the process. And in disappearing into the mangroves, they married into the local people. Often people think the Hokianga is the end of the earth, but I think Hokianga in many ways leads traditions.
Land here is soothing, away from the phones, people, everything.
We like the horse world, I call it, the horse world, because it slows everything down. You know, if you're a bit troublesome or a bit sad or something, you get on your horse and ride away around the bush and through the bush and way around the beach, and you see the fish darting out, and you know, it's...
Because there's no time when you ride.
Yes, it's no
time.
It's a peace with yourself. We used to watch Gene Autry on TV, and you know, with these fancy horses and things like that. And then Waimamaku was having that festival, so they said, let's put a cowboy show on. And before we do the show, this is the only real thing we do is serious. The policeman comes and checks all the bullets.
It's useless. It's a waste of time practicing because you get there and it's totally changed. The one time I married Clinton, my own brother made a wedding dress. It was so sick. And then I go, where's my husband? It's my brother. Where's my husband? I went to Australia for 8 years and it just made me realise I wanted to bring the kids up here. And here they got the whole farm, which is like freedom. It's absolute freedom.
I'm of the Tororo tribe. My hapu is Ngāti Uwe, and we come from Waimamaku. Lived there all my life, and my ancestry actually comes from here, a place called Kahumaku, which is just up the valley, the Weka Weka Valley, and we're really quite sporting people, good runners, because we've been chased everywhere by other tribes. This is a real fertile valley. It's got everything. It's been a gardening area, but the beach, the rivers were full of fish. Crayfish, abundance of crayfish. Power, we walked over them. But you'd throw your line out into the river and just sit at the window and fish for snapper. The snapper then weren't small snapper, they were huge. People used to fish for what they wanted. If they couldn't, you're pretty damn lazy.
From a little place called Otawa, Ngai Tuturu. Everybody calls me Mouse. And you've got all the generations. I used to be Mouse with cousins, then I became Auntie Mouse, now I'm Nanny Mouse. We lived in Waimau. The firstborn grandchild always goes back to live with the grandparents for a mate, for companionship, for whatever, for tono, whatever. And my mother wouldn't allow us to go and stay over in Otawa. And one day she was hanging the washing up at the back. She got this weird feeling and she went running to the front lawn. The two girls went there. And she looked up the hill and she saw this horse with a man on top and two little heads, one in front, one at the back. And she knew the old fellow had come over and stolen us. See, so she had to wait till Dad got home. And she said, Rangi, we're going to Otawa. You go and get my girls and bring them home. So my grandfather bargained, one stay, one go back. That's how I ended up living in Otawa, and my older sister went back to Mum and Dad. My grandfather said, yes. We must learn English, because that's your world for tomorrow out there. When you're ready for a husband, you come back and I will find him for you. Excuse me. And I have a really neat husband. Even though we haven't been together for 20 plus years, we are still good friends. We still care for each other. We still keep in touch. 1990, I left home and went out to search the world on my own. Prior to that, though, I had already started studying, extramural papers. And I worked for the finance director. At that time, they were the biggest organisation in New Zealand. I was his secretary. Then I went from secretary to being the boss. I came out of this big corporate life in silk suits and high heels to gumboots and jeans. While I was in Auckland, I had this feeling of fretting, I suppose is the word. I was fretting to come back home for whatever reason. Didn't have any idea, but now I know. And I had a moi moia, and it wasn't night time, it was kind of, I suppose, the time when you were half asleep, half awake in the morning. And what I saw was my grandparents beckoning to me from one of those rooms in that house that I had seen. I hadn't bought it yet, I'd just seen it, but they were beckoning to me. And I thought, well, and before long, everything seemed to fall in place and I was moving.
My name is PANIORA. I'm a farmer, a sewage contractor, a muso. I'm a man of all trades, I guess. No, we've got a very good place, a beautiful valley. I'm always giving glory to God for this beautiful green valley. Waimamaku. My sister and I was only about 8 to 9. We used to milk the moo-moos in the morning, take the milk up the factory on our old truck. Her and I, our parents were good parents. They brought us up. Well, we weren't short of anything. If we were short of anything, we would be pretty lazy.
I was born in Reinken Hospital, and I've been living here all my life. 3 older sisters and 4 older brothers. When they grew older, they all left to go and do what they wanted to do in Auckland and wherever. When it came to me, I was not allowed to leave home. Because my mother, when she reached the age of about 43, she got sick. I told her that I'm not leaving her, that I'm going to stay with her. She passed away at the age of 46. She died in my arms.
When my dad died, her husband, out of curiosity, wanted to go down the beach. He went down on his quad. Where's this old, the old man? Everybody heard about it. He died out in Waipuna. That's where he got drowned. Anyway, Wayne, out of curiosity, went down Beach Road, to suss out what's going on.
He got on his quad, went down and got down to our cemetery there. We just went around the corner there and he looked up and all he saw was this tractor coming towards him and his father sitting there waving out and big smile, and Wayne turned around and he looked and the quad went into the drain. He jumped off it and he turned around and he goes, "Where's that tractor gone?" And went to have a look. And when Wayne got it out, came home and I looked at Wayne and I said, "What's the matter?" And he goes, "I just saw Uncle John on his tractor," and I looked at Wayne and I said to him, "You can't have, he's dead, he drowned." And he goes, "Yeah, but I saw him down the road, he was waving and smiling at me."
Pākehā was my homestead, is still my homestead. My mum kept me home all the time to clean the house. It was my job to wash and cook and everything, and look after the farm. Because I was adopted, you see. I was whāngai to this family, so I got to do everything. I was the lucky one. Mum was a pretty bad alcoholic, So every day I was in fear of what sort of beating I'd get when I get home, It was always a beating every day. So I learned how to hunt, I learned how to get kai because that made them happy. That made Mum happy. So when she came home, if there was no kai, which there never was because she spent the bloody money in the thing, I always went for tuna because I could always get that, I could spear it, whatever. Or we had a shotgun that Puke built and I was able to go and steal some cartridges from up the whānaus or something, and take the gun. I ran away at 14, but I always used to run to walks. I'd walk through the bush and come out and moidua onto the main road, and then they'd pull up in the cock car, get in, every time. So I'd walk further the next time and come out in kawakawa or something, So they'd be watching me. And I always wanted to be a chef. Well, people aren't going to stop eating, so, I'll go for that. Man, I knocked on every restaurant door and hotel in Hawke's, I saw this van coming up next door all the time, something caterers, So I stuck over the fence and went, "Hey, he's not looking for anybody, are you?" "Well, I am." And he gave me a job as a kitchen hand, Well, I ended up at Annabelle's Theatre restaurant. And then blow me down, 6 months later, I actually took over that business, the catering business there, and I put myself through ATI. When everybody found out I was a chef back here, they said, "Oh, is he gay?"
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotze lechem min haaretz. Amen. Amen. My grandfather was the target of the program because he was subverting the students at the Cossack Academy. They would sneak out at night, come to my grandfather's house, and he would fill them with all this political, what was inimical to the regime. And that's why their ghetto was targeted and why they had to get out. My father, from the time he was bar mitzvahed, he didn't enter a synagogue except for, marriages and deaths. I didn't know anything about Judaism until I went to seminary. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hanoten shel Shabbat. Amen. Later on, after I had finished my PhD, I was recruited to teach Judaism at university. And I had to really learn about Judaism. And it's after that that I could explain to you why I didn't find what I was looking for in Judaism. But I wouldn't have known at the time at all.
I come from a drinking family. And I grew up believing that it was a party, everything you did, it was like every occasion there was drink, I remember as a little fella going shooting with my dad. He had a V8 pickup truck and he'd go road shooting with a shotgun across the seat, it was broken open with a couple of cartridges in it on the ready. And he'd have a bottle of beer between his legs. And I remember him going to the cow shed to milk cow, and he'd always have a dozen of beer and he'd be drinking as he was milking, My mum was yelling out for us to come home and me and my brother were playing in the creek. And I guess my dad could actually hear my mum calling and he'd finished milking by then and the machines had stopped and the cows had all gone back to the paddock. And he was on his way home and he had to go past this creek we're playing in and he'd come up behind us and we didn't know he was coming. And he grabbed a hold of me and my brother and pushed us under the water, And he held me down and I thought I was going to drown, and he let me up like this for a quick breath and pushed me under again. And so, I think in this day and age, my dad would have probably been in a lot of trouble, if he had been reported to the authorities. That's the way us kids were brought up. My early marriage, I would knock off work in the afternoon. I'd go off to work and I'd have intentions of I'm not going to the pub tonight, I'm going straight home. But by the end of the day, I'd be feeling like a drink, and I'd get home late and it was the same every night that my tea would be in the oven, my wife would be in bed. And until one day she said to me, I'm leaving you. I was into a Catholic boarding school. I never connected with God there. And I actually rebelled, And I was really, really depressed. I had no money for the kids for Christmas. I'd ground my business into the ground. But for the first time in my life, got down on my knees and prayed earnestly to God, I didn't believe he existed, but I said, God, if you do exist, I need your help. I'm crazy. Then all of a sudden, a peace came over me. And my foot came off the accelerator and I just felt at peace. And I just lost that urge to get that fix. A lot of people say to me that don't really believe in God, God's for weak people that got nowhere else to turn, And it might be, but I had nowhere else to turn. But that day, the desire to get wasted left me. I didn't know whether it wasn't the Catholic God or whatever I was crying out to. It was just a God of, hey God, if you do exist. I didn't doubt that he did. It was a God of my own understanding.
Just after I'd been first ordained as a priest in the mid-1980s, Bishop said, look, I've got a little job for you. There's a lady in the Hokianga who is having lots of arguments with Bishop Ted Buckle, and Bishop Ted can't stand it anymore. Do you think you would mind having something to do with this retreat house up in the Hokianga? And I said, well, I like retreat houses. I'll give it a go, yes. So I got to be part of the trust here with Clem Gordon, who lies buried just over there. This is where she finished up and created this retreat house centre on the model of a place for people to come to seek quiet, and not to live in community as such, but to have little houses spread around the property where they could spend a bit of time, let the city dust fall off their feet. In theory, I ought to be a right-wing git who supports the establishment and everything they do. So I'm not quite sure what it was about that my brother and I didn't turn out like that. I always like to say I was brought up British in Hawke's Bay. My granddad would stand by the wireless, he called it, at 9 o'clock in the morning when they always played God Save the King or God Save the Queen. And he would stand. And when he was too old to stand, he got his walking stick and put a hat on the end of the walking stick and held it up to show that he, even though he couldn't stand up for God Save the King, at least he was honouring.
Bara is where my great-grandparents came from. So it is a tiny little island at the bottom of the Outer Hebrides, off the west coast of Scotland. So my great-grandparents got left there when most of the people left for America, because the McNeil of Bara went bankrupt. So he sold the island and all of the people, because they all crossed it. They got sold to another Scotsman called Gordon of Cluny, who decided that he wanted to put sheep on the island. So he just said, you lot can go. So one day Dad came home and said, we're moving. We're not going to Canada because it snows. We're not going to Africa because there's snakes. We're not going to Australia because there's snakes, so that leaves New Zealand. So we're off in 3 weeks' time. When we got to New Zealand and I insisted on going barefoot, my father said to me, you can't do that. Only poor people go barefoot. The charities will come and give you boots.
I arrived at university, an extremely right-wing young man that you'd expect to come from the school that I came from, and so much so that I thought there was far too much damn liberalism around, so I formed a little group called Ad Dextra, to the right, you know. Even the National Party wasn't good enough for me, I wanted to go further. By 68, I was very much a young socialist and looking for something different.
Imagine what it would be like to live in a society which was so restrictive that you couldn't change anything, because then I would become introverted and completely miserable. And that, I guess, is harking back to what I said about the very start of New Zealand. It was people in Europe who felt like that. And with their last gasp, they got out.
Yeah, my name is Hermann Otto, Hermann the German. Born in Germany and lived in Munich till 1972, and then I decided to come to New Zealand. The end of the war, with soldiers everywhere and no food and nothing, which you had to go to the farmer, next door farmer, and barter some eggs and a piece of butter and maybe a litre of milk for an old oriental rug, you know, which my parents had maybe paid 20,000 Deutschmarks or whatever for it, you know. And all the houses, they looked like Christchurch, you know, all the windows were gone, everything was dark. And as a kid you think, that's interesting, you know, this is how life is.
It was post-war London, and you played around in the rubble. And I can remember sand, which was the foundation for the gun emplacements, because they were shooting off this hill just near where I lived at the Germans. Bang, bang.
We used to play on the debris. It was always called the debris. It was a bomb. And later, when I was older, I realised it was a bomb site. There had been a bomb fallen there. So they hadn't cleared any of that stuff up then when I was first growing up.
Well, my father went to war, put his age up, because he thought that going to war would be a great adventure. So he was a soldier at 18. First time he saw any action, he was captured. So he spent 5 years as a POW, marched right up through Germany to Poland, and had a pretty hard life, 18 to 24, early adulthood. Never told me any stories, but only tiny little snippets when he was drunk. But it certainly turned me into a pacifist.
We decided at the end of 78 to go to Israel, into a kibbutz. When I arrived with my friend in the kibbutz, the first thing the woman from Ramat Yochanan, the kibbutz there, said, "Oh, we will forgive you. As a German, we will forgive you." And I couldn't quite cope. I didn't know what to do with that. You know, there was history there that wasn't talked about in Germany. We were the next generation growing up. What do you do with something like that?
Of course, in history we talked about it. We saw lots of documentations where you saw piles of dead bodies, and like you get to see the true picture. We didn't actually have a ethical part of it. Always just like facts and facts and facts, and then deal with it. The more we talked about it, the more I felt really deep shame about what happened. Deep shame to have caused death to so many people. If someone asked me what would you have done, I couldn't say. I think that fear would probably have made me run with the crowd, and it's just terrible.
I am always discovering myself, so I'm not quite sure who I am or what I am. That's what I find out along the way. As far as I'm concerned, life is an exploration. So every day I discover more things about myself that I didn't know. So I don't have any fixed view of who I am or what I am or even where I'm going.
Mr. Hubert Humphrey, the Vice President of the United States, arrives just 48 hours later.
When New Zealand got involved in the Vietnam War, I made a decision on that point that if my name came up in the ballot, I would instantly register as a conscientious objector.
So I would have been 10 maybe, and listening to, the names or who were being called up to go to Vietnam. And I got vivid memories of that and thinking, I hope that finishes by the time I have to be called up.
I mean, these guys were all in danger of being called off to fight in a war in a country they didn't want to go to for a cause they didn't believe in, which politicised, a hell of a lot of people.
And we used to do these amazing demonstrations. Tim Shadbolt would get up in the quad and give a talk, and then everybody in the quad with him would march off down Queen Street. They were fantastic times, and I remember being a dead body being carried down to Queen Street and laid outside the US Embassy, and then the cops coming in, and it was always a challenge. We always wanted to be arrested, because being arrested, you'd made your point.
I got called up to go in the army to Vietnam, and at that stage the hippie movement had just arrived in Australia from America, and I immediately felt this draw, because here was conventional city life, and here were these people that looked like I felt.
If you are always into security, you're never ever going to take a chance, and you're therefore never ever going to grow. The security freezes you in the moment. Insecurity is incredibly informative.
I was working in a shop selling things, and that's how I met Claudia. I sold her a mobile phone.
Yeah, a bit more. You sold yourself pretty well. My dad is an English teacher, so he always wanted to live abroad, but they never did. They've always been open to languages and cultures, and which is why I did my exchanges when I was quite young. So I don't think it came as a surprise to them, really, that I brought a frog home.
You were calling me Froggy.
Frosch, der Frosch.
Germany was not for me the end of the line, kind of. I wanted to travel more.
We sold everything we had because we were hoping that we wouldn't come back.
I was impressed that I could manage to stay 24/7 with the same place.
I asked him, so now that we are together for so much time and you know me inside out, do you love me more or the same? And he said, and he thought about it and he said, actually less. And I was like,
did I say that?
You did.
In the kibbutz, I met MIGAEL. He was the long-haired hippie, and I thought he was a right plonker.
In all of the time that we travelled,
Yeah.
we didn't have a tent. We slept under the stars.
So we travelled together for a year, and then I took him home, warned my parents, yes, I've met this man, and he's got long hair, but it's clean. He's got earrings, but he's straight. Oh, dear. My mother fell in love with him, and that was my grace, and thank God for that. She loved him. She always wanted a daughter with long hair. I had this, so she there's my chance. When he was working for my dad, Mum would get up with him in the morning and plait his hair. When we got married, the ceremony is something totally. I have no idea what I said. I knew that somebody was laughing behind me because I said instead of my lawfully wedded husband, it was my awfully wedded husband.
So to this day, I'm still the awfully wedded husband.
Wedded husband.
Essentially, I was a working class boy from Manchester in the UK. My father, a panel beater, moving into a middle class profession.
We married when I'd finished training college and Tony had finished med school. We got married with absolutely zilch money at all. Both from working class families and had seen how tough it was for families. Both had a strong sense of social justice and wanted to do something that would make a difference in the world, really, that would make it worthwhile. So I think those were really strong connections, apart from a very strong physical attraction, of course.
I had a bit of a religious sort of teenage years, and going to Fiji was part of that.
It was just early independence, I mean about 2 months after we'd been there, so it was a real exuberant feeling. This was a country that was in charge of itself for the first time, and it was sloughing off colonial sort of structures, really, and it was a great time to be there.
Come from a village called Navitilevu in the Ra province of Fiji. You know exactly who you are there, who you are related to, and how you're related to them. And everything is in the oral tradition, so everything is passed along from the older people to the young ones. Respect was utmost in the village, is virtually the respect for a person. There was soro, for example, which is an apology. You know, you take some yangona, which is kava, and then you go present it to the person that you've wronged, you know, and you say, I'm sorry, and that's how it is. And then from then on, it is accepted, you know. I first sort of heard of the outside world was on the radio, you know, you could hear the radio going. And the wireless, they call it. And you hear the news and you look at this transistor and you're going, wow, what's this? And that's when you know there was something out there. I used to think that the language I spoke at the time, which is one of the oldest language in Fiji, the Ra dialect from there, was the only language, you know. I've been in New Zealand now for nearly 30 years now. I came here in 1984. I really thought that I would only come here for a year. My aunt, who lived in Australia at the time, she paid for my fare.
My dad was going round each of us and he said, oh, well, we've got to find who's going to be the nun or the priest in the family. Who's our vocation? So he went through all of us and we were all going, no, 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 Dad. And he got to my younger sister and he said, oh, well, nobody else wants to be Rob, so it must be you. And she rose up in ire. She was about 6 years old. I'm not going into any bloody convent. And my dad just exploded. Poor Rob. She didn't. But I think I internalised that it was getting rather important for somebody to say yes. And because it was seen as the higher calling of the church to be a nun or a priest, I think every family was encouraging at least one of their children to take on that role because it kept, I guess it earned pennies in heaven, in a sense, if you had a priest or a nun in your family. We spent 6 months in the noviceship as postulants, where we sort of were given the chance to really explore the life but see if we really wanted to be there. And then we made the choice that we become novices. And then you had another 2 years where you were a novice and then made first vows. That was the serious moment where you'd actually, from first vows on, you weren't supposed to leave. And it was a semi-enclosed order, so we didn't go out a lot. I kept falling in love with other nuns, which was, and trying to conquer that all the time. It was my constant battle, and I'm being quite honest here. That was my constant battle. But I did have that sense of ecstasy quite a lot, because that's what held you there, was that sort of sense of ecstasy when you were praying. I loved the simplicity of the life, but also I found it really hard. And I think the vow of poverty has stuck with me all my life, really. It's
I arranged to go on a motorcycle tour of the North and South Island with 3 mates. In those days, when you went on a tour, everyone would say, oh, go and stay with these people, they're good fun, and go and stay with those people, and he said, oh, go and look up these people, they're down at Ward near the South Island, they'll put you up, they'll be fine, We roar up these 4 bikies with leathers and helmets and sunnies and, and all beards, we were all quite fearsome looking guys, and I think they honestly took fright, thought they were being invaded by a bikie gang. Turned up and we spent about a week there and had a wonderful sort of week's partying with these folks. Janine's husband, Roger, was a fisherman, amongst other things, and musician, a wonderful guitarist, and wrote his own music, played fantastic guitar.
And so we sort of were there for about 6 months. And then they were cutting firewood and the saw just went to pieces and killed Roger.
Janine was in a very distressed state, of course. Eventually she came up and stayed the weekend with me at Easter, and in the process I realised I'd sort of halfway fallen in love with her. So when we got together I was suddenly dropped into a position of being an instant dad, and that was quite tough, but that was part of taking her on. I had to make a decision,
I mean, lucky. I don't know, quite why he wanted to persist exactly, but that's what he did.
The kingdom of God is about taking all the fallen and bringing them back. Because I believe everybody has to lift themselves up. But in order that they can lift themselves up, we sometimes have to create a world in which it's possible for them.
Talking about setting people free.
Yeah, setting people free.
10 things that made me leave America. Police brutality.
Politics.
Ungovernability politically.
Pollution.
Guns everywhere.
Guns, especially guns.
Violent attitudes.
I was frightened of the police.
And political unresponsiveness. All of that goes together. I mean, it was filthy.
If you visit American City, you will find it very pretty. Just 2 things of which you must beware. Don't drink the water and don't breathe the air.
That's only a little bit. Usually get it quite full.
but it's pretty much done now.
I was born in southeast Queensland, up in the rainforest. We lived in a kind of a log cabin, a slab cabin actually it was, and no lights, no toilet, no water, nothing like that. Everything, and all the beasties in the forest used to share our house with them, including the snakes and the wallabies and the bandicoots and insects by the million. When we were in Alaska was the 70s and the oil shocks and the confrontation with Russia and so on, and they had these almost daily patrols of the SAC bombers, the Strategic Air Command, going. They flew right over Sitka in Alaska. I'm probably a bit paranoid, but I decided that the family should live on a sailboat so we could get out of there if things went wrong, because I could see they could easily go wrong. And we bought an ocean cruising sailboat and lived on that instead of a house. That turned out to be the beginning of a trip across the Pacific through Mexico and the South Pacific to New Zealand. And then when we got to New Zealand, Mary said she'd had enough of sailing, so we sold the boat and bought this farm. I'd well and truly learnt that being dependent on the power system and all the other systems of civilization was risky, so I wanted to be independent power-wise, independent building-wise, didn't want to have any loans or so on. And so we found this place with hydropower potential and decided to build this weird house, and as a result we were able to build it without finance, and it makes a big difference.
I teach a carpentry course at the North Tech Polytech campus here in Reinken. Over the last couple of years we've sort of evolved the course to be more focused on cheap housing and addressing the housing issues around here.
Ripping up this newspaper and putting it into buckets of water, and then it softens right down and becomes like a pulpy mass. They've got to be quite small bits, but it's just breaking down finer. And then we pulp it up and eventually it turns into this stuff, which is what we use in our mix.
We're using a sort of variation of the wattle and daub technique, and we're just using the old beer bottles as an infill between the tradition. This is normal standard sort of what's called lightweight timber frame building. That's your classic just stud framing. And then we're plaster from both sides and locks everything into place and sort of grips on and holds on to that. This is $2,000. You know, I think it's been a long time since housing genuinely reflected the true material value of the houses. You know, it's $200,000 or $300,000 for a house is, you know, and that's around here. You know, $500,000 in a lot of places is just ridiculous and totally out of reach.
More salad, anybody?
What architecture should be about is empowering people to build. And that is one of the most basic principles of life, is empowering people to take control of their own lives. I think that New Zealanders have really come into their own when they've stepped outside that mould, so that you find some New Zealander lost in the middle of Africa, and there the bureaucracy hasn't got to them, that repressive culture hasn't got to them, and they just deal with the situation in front of them, and that's where they shine.
I had the good fortune to win a scholarship that sent me to Oxford University, where I met lots of other people who'd come from all around the world, and I chose as my first job to go to Tanzania in East Africa, because I didn't want to come back home. I wanted to do something different. And then I learned about British imperialism, and then I learned about colonialism, and I learned about racism, and I was a tiny minority of whites in a now African-ruled country who were most concerned indeed about the fact that New Zealand, the country I came from, seemed to be one of the best friends that South Africa had in the world, and constantly hosted them for sporting events and wool trade and all that sort of thing. And Tanzanians would ask me, when's New Zealand's Independence Day? And I'd say, we don't have an Independence Day. They said, well, you are independent, aren't you? I said, well, I think we are. Yes, we're a member of the United Nations, but we don't really have an Independence Day. Oh, well, what do you have? Oh, well, we have Waitangi Day. What's that? I explained something about what was that. They said, oh, you celebrate the arrival of imperialism. You celebrate Māori chiefs giving their country away to the British.
We've carried on the pain of what it must have felt like when our land was lost, when our caves were desecrated, the things taken out in sledge loads. And what hurts the most, that land was set aside as a reservation and was lost in the sale of Waimamaku number 2, as we call it. This block, Waimamaku number 2, which went right down this side of the river, it was sold subject to 2,700 acres being set aside for the Māori to continue living here as a reserve, as a papakainga, but also as a wahitapu, where the bones of our people were buried. And we lost the 2,700 acres. We also lost the control of our burial caves. I can live with that, but what I can't live with is we're having to buy back our burial places. That, to me, is an insult to our culture.
Samuel, when you look over there, then it's just folding those in. Right, so you try and get them in as close to them there, but don't do that. I come from Kaikohe. Kaikohe was a place that pretty much everyone knew each other, and there was certainly a nice mix of Pākehā and Māori. Although there was probably another fringe to that too, which I didn't really know about. But when I talked to other people, you know, they were affected by that. I mean, I can remember one of our neighbours, you know, being called by, you know, a white maggot, you know. So there was definitely the undercurrents of racism going on, you know, in both ways.
The best boyfriend I had when I was growing up was Mormon, and he worked in a bank. And when I took him, it was the best I could find. When I took him home, my parents met him at the door, and he was brown and wasn't on.
I was brought up in Gore Southland. I had two parents that were from both the North Island, one a moko of Pataoni and the other a moko of Tamarau Takurua from Tūhoi. However, we were brought up never really knowing who we were. I was deeply ashamed of having any Māori connections whatsoever, actually. Deeply ashamed. And I have a beautiful mother, but I didn't like being seen with her. With my colouring and stuff, I could get away with not being Māori, but if you saw Mum, then you knew the secret was out.
Within our own family, there were key things that still kind of told us we were, you know, that we were of Māori descent. But we're growing up in the time of, you know, where we were quarter castes or half castes, and really half castes were the ones that were really counted as Māori. And because I can remember, you know, them doing a census when I was 5, and we knew then we were Māori, and standing up and being told, oh no, sit down because you're quarter caste.
I knew what racism was from a young age. You could feel it. And what it did was it gave me a heart, it developed a heart for people that are on the fringes. As I grew older, I used to collect people that didn't have a home, or Mum said I'd bring them home to stay.
We didn't go to the marae like kids go to the marae now. I didn't know that part of me. I didn't know who I was in terms of whakapapa and things like that. I mean, I started learning Māori. I started doing things like Māori papers, and that's when you learnt about these things, you know. And, you know, I would go home and I'd have a badge, you know. The treaty is a fraud, you know, so off you truck back home, and of course it's almost wrenched out of your hands by all the old Māori ladies telling you, the treaty is not a fraud. Ripped off you, you know. So these weren't Pākehā saying, or my Pākehā relatives saying, you know, what are you talking about? It was actually Māori people who, they weren't saying things were fine, but they were saying the treaty's not a fraud. We were doing papers with Ranginui Walker. I mean, you can't do a paper with Ranginui Walker without having your eyes open. The university in those times was the times of, you know, the Māori students beating up the engineer students because they did the haka. You know, so, you know, this is the world I was suddenly opening my eyes to and saying, oh, okay.
We became the hosts for all the politicos that came into the country in Christchurch. So every time they did the circuits, they would stop at Cashel Street in Christchurch and we would put them up. Yeah, so it definitely developed the activist in me. My mother's from Rātoki, and the great thing about being born and bred in Tūhoi is that they have a confidence about tikana Māori, you know, and connecting to these amazing people. They were able to draw me in and embrace me much more than I was able to do it to them. You know, I think in a way they had a deeper understanding of me than I had of myself at the time. We were protesting, we were in and out of court. This Tame showed me that when you don't believe in something, you want something stopped, you just go and physically stop it.
But the term race doesn't get used much these days, but that was the language of those days. And so we were involved working with Tita Whaiharuera and Betty Walk and Fred Ellis on inner city housing issues when Māori used to be inner city people, Freeman's Bay and Ponsonby. And then with the Polynesian people who have been knocked around a lot by the police and the overstayers and stuff. And so I got heavily involved in all of that. Police dogs being used on people. And so I was one of the people that constantly went around hounding the politicians and the media over sort of racism issues.
The land on which the buildings and other property hereabouts stand is Crown land.
Lies.
Such buildings and other property are here without lawful authority.
Lies. Lies.
I was part of a neighbourhood group that was trying to frustrate Muldoon. Anything that Muldoon wanted to do, we wanted to oppose. That's how our politics worked, basically. And he wanted to sell off this land, and so a group of us set up a little tent and said, you know, Muldoon's trying to get this last bit of open space in central Auckland to hock it off to his mates who want to develop it for rich people's housing, like Mission Bay down there. Someone said I should go and speak to Joe Hawke, so I went and spoke to Joe Hawke, and he said, we'll occupy the land.
I think my first endeavour was going to Bastion Point and being able to hang around with the Hawkes the night before the arrest. We kind of got to stay in the background of this wharepuni, just observing, listening, growing in our awareness of what was happening.
That seared in my soul that night. My girl died, and then we had to have a huge discussion. Is the occupation going to continue? You know, is it too big a cost? And then she will have died in vain if we just walk out and don't achieve our objectives. All of that went on all night that night, and that I think that night really solidified my commitment to working on anti-racism issues and supporting kaupapa Māori for the rest of my life since, really.
It was terribly sad on the day. I didn't choose to get arrested out of fear at the time, because
I'd been so indoctrinated with, the police, and that I had no understanding of the processes of getting arrested, and I was still worried about my parents at that time. Now, I would have been part of the arrest process, but back then it was too new and I was too naive.
I hereby require every such person to leave this place.
The people who paddle their canoes here said, I've had enough. This is too overcrowded. Let's go and find something new. Let's go and find a new country. In other words, they were explorers, so they paddled canoes across and found New Zealand. We fast forward to other generations, Irish sailors, whalers, all of the other people. They all came here either after a new life or because they wanted to be free. And so some of my forebears jumped off ships with a biscuit tin and swam ashore, and all they had when they arrived in this country was an empty biscuit tin. Now, most people would say that's not a very good start to a life, but what they had was an empty biscuit tin and freedom. I have a passionate belief that New Zealand is based on the idea of freedom. It's based on the idea that I'm willing to leave behind everything and go out and find a new life.
We wanted to be self-sufficient, we wanted to get away from the rat race, and we wanted to live in a really nice area. So Northland beckoned, Hokianga beckoned, and we came up here, and we moved up here 29 years ago, and never regretted it because it's just such a wonderful place to live. It's paradise.
A lot of it was about being sustainable. We were all planning to have, grow everything that we would eat, including, wheat, and have our own cows and make our own cheese and etc. A simple life.
At that time, a friend of mine, Rongo, and I were reading a lot about the American Indians and their philosophies and their way of life and how their lives fitted in with nature. And it was really appealing. And when we heard the stories from the first movements of the communes in the Hokianga, it seemed to suit a lot of the philosophies that we had. And so we moved up into the Hokianga in search of the dream.
All we had for building materials was some old logs that we'd found up the hill, some rolls of clear plastic that somebody had given us, some pieces of perspex, and some old corrugated iron.
We had no experience really of living on the land or building any alternative buildings, or we were completely green. And we came and we built a little tea tree and nikau whare in a little piece of the bush, and we put in a little vegetable garden, and we cooked on an open fire at the entranceway of the whare, and we had to bathe in the river. And this was my first introduction to the Hokianga.
The first thing I always did was put in a garden and start looking around to put in some fruit trees.
We ended up getting a pig.
And then I ended up running pigs for 5 years.
We lived on a small income.
One year I think we had $2,000.
And it usually cost us, in those days, about at least $1,000 just to run a car for a year.
Sort of living in those situations. I mean, our bed was built out of bamboo poles all together with old bus seats on it, so it all came apart at the seams when you lay on it. So everything, had this quality of kind of makeshift. And the house we built had 2 walls that didn't have anything on them. One faced into the bush, and the other one we put a big curtain over. But we felt incredibly warm. You'd light the fire and it was really warm. I didn't feel the cold. We hardly wore a jersey. It was just, we were really tough, really, really tough at the time.
I can remember, though, when we were building the house, we had a bath, a cast iron bath sitting over the house side, and we were digging our foundations, and a bunch of guys on sort of off-road bikes stopped on the road up there and looked at us and they said, "Ho, get a house first, eh?"
And they actually thought that we were going to be a bit like Charlie Manson's group in Canada, and they were sort of quaking in their beds a little bit initially.
We knew there were people who did put us down in their, people like the council and that sort of stuff, they didn't like us. But
there was quite a bit of suspicion and prejudice.
But it wasn't that bad.
I think that was what it was about. It was about learning your frontiers, really. You learned by experience what you could handle and what you couldn't handle. And I think, being young, you could really handle a lot. I mean, when I think of what I did, mostly we were barefoot. We didn't have hardly any money for shoes, so you really wore them, and so slopping my way through mud up that hill, 2 miles in from the road, through the forest, with a baby on my back, or food on my back, and one of us carrying the baby and one of us carrying the food. It was hard yakka, but I don't know, I felt immensely strong and able to do it, and I was going to do that for the rest of my life.
Akuri toku mihi ki ngā kai mahi me ngā kai whakahare o te mahi nei o nei taonga, taonga tāhua. A lot of the use that these things had back in the day when they were just normal things of everyday life has been lost with other things coming in. But it's lovely to see it held on to, because actually it does, in a way, it feeds our wairu, our spirit, it lifts us up. Beauty does that for us, and these things are so beautiful. And so, you set a plastic bucket there and it's serviceable, but you don't go, wow, And that's because people have put their sweat and their aroha and their mohiotanga into these things.
There's a bit more reality around, because people aren't so caught up in the whole capitalist system of chasing the dollar. Because the land's not particularly good for farming, and there's no industry, and fishing's limited on the west coast and all that sort of thing.
I certainly don't think there's anywhere better in New Zealand in terms of a beautiful place and a beautiful community.
So, it's not really a place people come to make money. So you get people that are thinking differently to that, and like attracts like.
I always see it as a returning place, the place where you come back to. Hokianga nui a kupe, that's what I understand it as, a place that once you've been here, you always return, and it's spiritual returning. Everybody I know who comes here is touched by it and goes through some sort of transformation.
It's like you go through a gateway when you go through that forest, the real spiritual force that is held here, I think.
Aucklanders wouldn't, what on earth do you do all the time? The Māori world that we live in gets cluttered up with all the noise, eh? Here, the noise you hear are birds, the ocean, the whistle of the trees,
When we came here and we said we were going to grow avocados, people said, "Avo what?" They really didn't know what we were talking about, and then they told their friends we'd come here to grow kiwi fruit, because they knew what kiwi fruit was. But there weren't any of these trees. We planted 10,000 trees in the first 4 years that we were here. Because you walk around and you plant these little trees, and then after a while you look up at those little trees. We'd sold avocados to Auckland, to an organic outlet down there. They were good years, and then later on when the kids grew up and left home, went to university, then my husband got sick, and then he got sicker, and then he died. He didn't imagine that it would all be really, really hard, and that I'd be on my own for many years. And he was always of the opinion that because it's such a lovely place and I'm such a lovely person, there'd be a queue of fellows waiting to come and take over. It wasn't quite like that. I'm a lucky woman.
Believing in peace and justice. Justice is, to be a Christian is, you're talking about sustainability, you're talking about, loving and respecting everybody. What we get, the life we're leading in New Zealand, is a false life. It's based on the backs of half of the rest of the world. The kids that are leaving a lot of classrooms are not prepared for the world out there. And how do you prepare them for the world out there?
I talk about the village a lot in my teaching and how I grew up. And to me, I don't have any children of my own. It just didn't happen, you know, one of those things. But to me, when I have children in front of me, it's like family to me. It is like they're all individuals to me. There's no group, and I'm trying to do, the best as I can, and teach them the values that I grew up with, you know.
When I went away, I swore I'd never come back, but I did because, whānau were passing away and you have to come home to these tangis. And, well, blow me down. Yeah, Mum called me in one day because she wanted to say sorry, and I wouldn't wear it, After she had gone, I didn't know. I still didn't click, and then all the brothers called me back to a hui and, Mum left you everything. I kept it right up until 2 years ago, and then I gave it to my little brother. First few years here, I had all the baddies. No one wanted them in their classes, but I took them. I got on the right with them. The kids are getting 40 to 50 credits a year now from me, and doing a lot of catering, and a lot of my students, a lot of them, probably about 6 of them are nearly qualified chefs now, since I've been here.
When I was very young, I used to think it would be wonderful to get a whole series of like-minded people and we'd all live together and we'd all be so supportive. This is 50s, 60s, communes. And what I didn't realise is that actually is a ghetto, not a community. And community is about people being incredibly diverse, having different values, different standards, different attitudes. They read different books, but they all interact.
We were put under threat, government threat, to lose our medical service. And so there was a meeting called in Rawene, and everybody knew about it. And the organisation was such that the word went out into each community, come to this meeting in Rawene. If it's the last thing you do, come to this meeting in Rawene, and don't come with a spare seat in your car. Bring people with you. And so we went into Rawene and it was packed.
The Hokianga, remote, rural and poorer than most, an area with a strong sense of community, an area determined to protect its special health system. At a packed meeting, locals vote to strike out on their own.
Dame Whina Cooper threatened to give her certificate back as being a Dane. And we had the priest, Brian Prendleville.
The health service in the Hokianga is so well organised, the doctor doesn't have to get money from the people. He gets a wage. He's not getting $200,000. He's getting too much anyway.
He had a small baby that he was cradling. I said, what's it all about? It's about people.
Do we favour this or this? Do we favour the baby, the tangata? It's on about people, not on about, we've got such a big debt. If the money that was spent on other things that are not important, but people came first, then we would be able to care for one another.
In terms of community action, it was a model.
Absolutely a textbook case of very good, smart community action and mobilising the local community, but also reading the political signals and where to actually be very strategic about not just going anti-government policy, which was ultimately going to be very damaging, but also to say, here's a positive way that we could go forward.
But I told him, I'm British. No more national with me as long as that Prime Minister is there.
So they were calling for kind of nominations and volunteers from different areas. And Gwen Freese was up on the stage and she said, "There's somebody from Taheki." And I thought, who's that? Oh, Craig, it's me.
We had a two-pronged campaign. We had people on the public relations side, and we had basically myself and Judy working on the political and information side.
We were scurrying around like ants working out how to make things go here, there and everywhere, you know.
As you can imagine, it was not an easy time because not everybody went along with you, particularly amongst the medical staff. And the trust that was formed took ownership of the assets and liabilities of the former business unit.
Chris Diamond is the first chair of the trust. It was absolutely clear this organisation was going to work with integrity. There was going to be no funny business with the money, no funny business with the staff. It was all going to be clear and above board and, you know, properly done.
Because one of the cornerstones of the trust is to seek equity in funding, and that means we have got a high needs Māori population and we have an entitlement to a certain share of government funding for that, and we still feel we don't get our fair share. And while we give free healthcare, they can always say, well, why don't you charge a little bit? You know? And we say, that's not the point. We can do this and we will not give that up, but we still are entitled to our fair share. And that was a coming together of a lot of very good skills and perseverance and actually that spiritual strength that this is the right thing to be doing. So tika, doing the right, the proper, the just thing, that means that you are focusing on your purpose. Pono, doing that with integrity, truth, looking for the evidence of what will be the best way of doing things. And then aroha, compassion for the human impact of whatever that decision is that you're making.
Giving understanding to the doctors on how Māori tick. It's not always a pill they want. It's not always an injection. It may be just listening, because to me, healthcare for an individual is from within. It's what you think that heals you or kills you.
You know, that was one example of some of the great things that have happened in this community because there was a local community organisation willing to front that.
We work really well with the DHB, with Hospital and Whangarei, to make sure that it's totally to their advantage that we are here and we are worth it to be here, that they never think they can do the job better from anywhere else.
This is not just an economic system which is falling apart. It's actually that we are destroying our own life.
If we were truly alive, like we didn't have all this stuff getting in the way, we would wake up in the morning and be awestruck. And imagine a society where everybody was like that. Instead of moving into despair, we would move into hope.
You must never lose hope. Never lose hope. One thing that they can't take away from you is your spiritual beliefs that are inside and your hope for your future generations.
Opportunity and chance and a decent life, not lots and lots of money, but a decent, rich, fulfilling life for all of us.
I feel always really hopeful. I'm a very optimistic person, I think. So I see what my children do, I see how they're bringing up their children, and I see these amazing individuals who I think will be able to find ways to live with integrity in the worlds they inhabit.
I would like to see my grandchildren, if I have them, and other people's grandchildren, to have a life where they can know what's real in the world, what's important, not make money the god.
I still do try and live in hope, and still am only frustrated because I want to do more. It's the biggest lesson I've learned of late. The first port of call is myself.
When we really get down to it, if you're from Scotland, well, somewhere back there was a connection with the whenua. You followed the moon. You planted by the moon. You were observant of nature. You didn't destroy nature. There are things that we as Māori can rekindle in other people, but we've got to be doing it.
But we're quite a lot of diverse people who are living in this country and come from a range of backgrounds. And if it's going to go well for us, then we need to understand each other a lot better than we do.
I think I probably would want the same as my mother and father wanted for us. And that they be safe and that they grow up to love where they are. And it's like the Bible, love one another.
And I think if we could be less aggressive, more thoughtful. I had a lovely quote from the Dalai Lama recently. It said, "When at all possible, be kind. It is always possible."
Go out, take a risk, live at the edge. You don't know what's going to happen, but when it happens, grab hold of it and run with it, because then you're going to have certainly an exciting life.
What we've got is a little group of people dancing up the road. But nobody said you can't join in. And imagine if people had started coming out of their houses, had started coming out of their farms, had begun that. And imagine if we reached the end of that road and there were 6 billion people dancing and singing and sharing, and the animals, and we were singing, and there was a jazz band, and the music was filling the air, and we would say,
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.